Hey, this is Pastor John from H2O Church, and whether you're part of H2O or just checking this out, I hope that this is a great encouragement to you. We are doing a 5-part Facebook Live event called Journey to the Cross. So far, we've looked at the Last Supper, the Garden of Gethsemane, and then the trials of Jesus. So this here, part 4, we're going to look at the Crucifixion. Before we get started, I just have to say that as I prepared for this, I thought, man, this is going to be really difficult to get through this one. Sometimes it's really good and really hard to look at painful things. And we're going to look at the most painful thing we've ever seen. To pick up where we left off, Pilate is trapped. His hope is to bloody Jesus so that the Jews will feel mercy and avoid crucifixion. So he hands Jesus over to be scourged. And I want to remind you that the Romans hated the Jews, but this was the king of the Jews. So as they prepared to scourge him, he would have been stripped naked and his hands tied to a post above his head. The whip was made of leather ropes of various lengths and interwoven with sharp, jagged pieces of bone and lead. The idea was to whip, grip, and then rip. So the whip would come across Jesus's back and legs, and the bones would then grip the flesh. And then the Roman guard would pull it back quickly, ripping flesh. There's a Journal of the American Medical Association article that said, as the Roman soldiers repeatedly struck the victim's back with full force, the iron balls would cause deep contusions, and the leather thongs and sheep bones would cut into the skin and subcutaneous tissue. Then as the flogging continued, the lacerations would tear into the underlying skeletal muscles and produce quivering ribbons of bleeding flesh. Now the Jews had a limit on the punishment that they could put out. It was 40 lashes, but the Romans had no limitations. So they could go on as long as they wanted. Isaiah 52 verse 14 says this, everyone was appalled. He didn't even look human. A ruined face, disfigured past recognition. One of the things I wasn't aware of in preparing for this is that the Roman soldiers gathered the entire battalion in front of the already scourged Jesus. So imagine 600 men gathered around a stripped Jesus. They put a scarlet robe on him and then wove a crown of thorns, which they placed on his head. And they put a reed in his right hand, imitating a scepter, a ruler's rod. And they would bow down before him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews." And then they would spit upon him and hit him in the face with the reed. So just to remind you, the scalp is one of the most vascularized areas in the body. So imagine the blood just pouring off of his head. Dr. Mark Eastman, in another article, said Jesus had not drunk since the night before. So the combination of the beatings, the crown of thorns, and the scourging would have set into motion an irreversible process of severe dehydration and cardiorespiratory failure. All of this was done so that the prophecy of Isaiah would be fulfilled. I gave my back to the smiters, and my cheeks to them that plucked off the hair. I did not hide my face from shame and spitting. Isaiah 50, verse 6. So Jesus is wearing the crown of thorns and the scarlet robe when Pilate brings him out in front of the people in one last desperate attempt to get Jesus released. and he says, "Behold the man." Someone in the crowd cried out, "We have a law, and by that law he deserves to die because he made himself the Son of God." And this terrified Pilate even more. John chapter 19, verse 7. But Pilate was trapped. He knew that there was no way out of this, and so he handed Jesus over to be crucified. Most scholars think that the condemned would be forced to carry the horizontal beam of the cross, called the patibulum, from the prison inside the city to a location outside the city. And this patibulum likely weighed about 100 pounds. And so in this weakened state, it makes sense that Jesus would stagger and fall repeatedly on his way. About this time, there's a man coming into the city named Simon, and he was from Cyrene, which is modern-day Libya. And Simon gets pressed into service to carry the cross of Jesus. There's an interesting note here that the Gospel of Mark mentions Simon's two sons, Alexander and Rufus. That suggests that Mark, who's writing his gospel from Rome, that Alexander and Rufus had become believers and were known by the believers in Rome, and that's why he included them in his gospel. There's another astounding little detail that Luke records. If you imagine Jesus and Simon carrying a cross together, and Jesus has a large multitude of people following behind him. The Jesus movies rarely capture this, but Luke says it was a great multitude following behind Jesus, mourning and lamenting and weeping. And Jesus actually stops and says, "Daughters of Jerusalem, don't weep for me. For days are coming when they'll say, 'Blessed is she who had no children.'" And Jesus is thinking at that time about what he had prophesied, that Jerusalem would be surrounded by the Romans in 70 AD and utterly destroyed. And it's remarkable to me that he felt compassion in the middle of his suffering. So a titulus, or a small sign stating the victim's crime, was usually placed on a staff and either carried by someone in front of the procession or hung around the criminal's neck. Regardless, it was later nailed to the cross so that it extended above the head and everyone could see it. Again, there's a subtle detail that's very important. When Jesus was put on the cross, Pilate had written, "Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews," and he had it written in Greek, Hebrew, and Latin. And the Jewish leaders demanded that that sign be changed to say, "Jesus said he was the King of the Jews." But Pilate refused to change the wording. Pilate was taking a final shot at the Jewish leaders who had trapped him by saying, "Here is your king." So Simon carries the cross until the 650-yard journey from the fortress Antonia to Golgotha is finally completed. Golgotha, by the way, is Hebrew, and it means place of the skull, and no one knows exactly why it has that name. Some have speculated that there were skulls laying around, but because of the Jewish fixation on not being defiled by touching a human corpse, that's unlikely. Regardless, we're probably more familiar with the Latin word for Golgotha, Calvary. So Jesus is offered wine mixed with myrrh, which is a mild analgesic to reduce the pain, but he refuses to drink it. Simon is ordered to place the patibulum or the crossbeam on the ground, and Jesus would quickly be thrown onto the crossbeam by the execution squad of 4 soldiers. Just to give you some background on this, the Romans were experts at crucifixion. They actually aren't the ones that invented it, but they perfected it. And it works so well as a deterrent for them. Anyone that came across a Roman execution would quake with fear of suffering a similar fate, because this form of torture was gruesome and degrading and led to an intensely painful death. Roman speaker, an orator named Cicero, called crucifixion the most cruel and hideous of tortures. He said, the very mention of the cross should be far removed, not only from a Roman citizen's body, but from his mind, his eyes, and his ears. So this is not depicted in the movies, of course, and you may not be aware of this, but first, the condemned were stripped naked in order to die with as little dignity as possible. Then there were the nails, iron spikes that averaged 5 to 7 inches in length. Modern art has often depicted the nails into the hands, and that's a misunderstanding. Historical Roman accounts have verified that it was through the 2 bones in the forearm, the radius and the ulna. And the misconception may have been based on Jesus's conversation with doubting Thomas when he said, observe my hands. But in ancient times, the wrist was considered part of the hand. So the nails were driven through the wrist between the radius and the ulna. In my 1 year of physical therapy, I learned what's there. The median nerve, which would have caused sharp pain shooting throughout his arm. Then Jesus' feet were pierced with nails, the guards twisting his legs into an unnatural and painful position at 45 degrees. So he was forced to bear his weight with the muscles of his thighs, which is a position that's impossible to maintain for very long. Think about wall squats. Within a few minutes of being placed on the cross, Jesus' shoulders were almost certainly dislocated. And this too fulfilled prophecy. Psalm 22 verse 14 says, I am poured out like water and all my bones are out of joint. Another prophecy, Isaiah 53:12, says that he was numbered with transgressors or sinners. That's a reference to him being crucified between 2 thieves, one to his left and one to his right. Again, from an article, Dr. Alexander Metherell said, the pain was absolutely unbearable. In fact, it was literally beyond words to describe. And I didn't know this. They had to invent a new word, excruciating, which literally means out of the cross. And so the whole problem with crucifixion is it's very difficult to exhale. In order to breathe out and then take in fresh air, it was necessary to push up on the nailed feet, which would have caused intense pain. Those that watched the crucifixion, again, of Jesus being completely naked, were the religious leaders who had hated him, the crowds that had mocked him. The thieves on both sides of him began to jeer and swear and laugh at him, even as they were dying. The Roman soldiers, too, would mock him. They said, if you're the Son of God, come down off the cross and we'll believe in you. The people that were his followers who were there, John was actually the only man close to the cross. Also, there was Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James the Lesser, Salome, the mother of James and John. Luke 23 says that all of his acquaintances, the other disciples, stood off at a distance. I just want to remind you of the words of Simeon that he spoke. Simeon was an old man when Mary carried the baby Jesus into the temple to be circumcised. And Simeon said, "Now I can die in peace, for my eyes have seen my salvation." But then he looked at Mary and he said, a sword shall pierce your soul. Can you imagine his mother watching him die? So when I heard about the cross for the first time, it just captured my heart. No one has loved us like this. And sometimes it's good to just look at the heaviest of things, to begin to comprehend the depth of love that God has for us. Hebrews 12:2 says, we're to look to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. I hope this has been encouraging for you, and I hope you'll join me in our last talk coming up here at noon. We're going to look at the words that Jesus spoke from the cross. And again, if this has impacted you, can you hit the share button and let your friends know about this? Thanks so much for joining me in this very difficult and painful